Jeremy is the author of Unprotected Class, senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. Lots to discuss here. So, Jeremy, I want to start here with the Tim Walz story, who, of course, is Kamala's emotional support animal. Minnesota's health department rationed life-saving care based on race. Tell us about this, Jeremy.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a time earlier in the pandemic where there was some important treatments called monoclonal antibodies, and there were a variety of actual health-based metrics that were used as they should have been to evaluate who was going to get access to these scarce treatments. But Governor Walz was put in and his team put another thing that said, if you're Black, or I think there were some other minorities to jump ahead. And eventually that turned out to be pretty unpopular, and they finally backed off of it. But it kind of showed you where his heart and mind was on a lot of these issues.
Yeah, so help me understand. So they proposed it and they backed off of it. And so who is essentially the author of this idea that life-saving care should be implemented based on race? And they did implement. Help us understand.
Yeah, so they did implement it, but I think after a month there was enough pushback, even in fairly liberal Minnesota, that they walked it back for a time. But that's really just because they got caught. It's just indicative of his approach throughout. I mean, there was no pandering on race that was ever too low for Governor Walz. I mean, he passed a bill that banned discrimination against people based on their hairstyles, particularly African-American traditional hairstyles. Now, again, you might think, well, that's harmless. But again, it's just one of these things that actors can use to say, well, you're discriminating against me for this or that. Kind of a typical way for people to cause problems in a sort of harmless sounding bill. So there was no kind of racial pandering that was ever too small for this administration.
So your entire book, Unprotected Class, highlights the war on white people, how anti-white racism is tearing America apart. Have we seen any improvement on the war on whites in the sense where there's some people backing off post-2020, or is it just as bad as it was 4 years ago?
I think, Charlie, some of the ridiculousness has receded a little bit. I mean, but George Floyd, the way I kind of guy her is not eventually going to gain strength again. Some of the stuff that was said was so ridiculous that, even the left kind of backed off it for a little while. But I expect, and I saw Aaron Sabarium, who's done a lot of great reporting on this, said the same thing today. I expect this is going to get worse before it gets better. And of course, Tim Walz's Minnesota was ground zero for this. And in fact, I opened the book by talking about George Floyd in Minneapolis, because that was the test case that kicked it all off. And it was Governor Walz's failed leadership and his failure. Even the liberal mayor of Minneapolis said, please bring in the National Guard troops. And it took 3 days before Governor Walz was willing to act to put down racial unrest. And again, I just think it really shows his bad judgment and where his political priorities lie.
So just more broadly, are we starting to see public sentiment shifting against this unrepentant and disgusting war on white people?
Well, I hope so a little bit. I mean, I'd like to think that my book has contributed to some degree, because it's done pretty well. And Charlie, I thank you a lot for having me on to talk about it, because that was certainly one of the things that was great in helping to kick it off. So I think the good news is that our side, which I mean just sort of the right generally, is I think getting more comfortable in pushing back against some of the more outrageous things that the left is doing on race. I think that's the good news, and that's really important good news, because I think if we push back and we're consistent about pushing back, we'll ultimately win, because I think more Americans want us not to discriminate on race than who want us to discriminate on race. The problem, and I'd say the two downsides are, one of the reasons that we're pushing back is that the problem has just gotten a lot worse to the point that people kind of felt like, hey, we need to push back now because we can't pretend that this isn't a problem. Second piece of bad news we have in that regard is the left, I don't think, has reduced its commitment at all to this type of anti-white discrimination, to just continuing to say more and more ridiculous things. And I think a Harris-Walz administration, if we're unfortunate enough to get one, will just turbocharge all of those negative trends on the left.